To understand why the misses started to look like mercy, we need to meet the engineer who decided fire could lie on command. The fire engineer, Colonel Turner's problem set. Meet Colonel John Turner, a civil engineer with the temperament of a surveyor and the nerve of a sapper. He'd retired from the Royal Engineers, then got dragged back by the Air Ministry works with a mandate that sounded like a dare. Save cities without asking for more fighters, more guns, or more light in a blackout that already felt absolute. He didn't bring romance to it. He brought notebooks filled with all-fire behavior, factory hazard audits, and the cold math of how heat flows when you don't want it to. Here's the pivot that changed the winter. Turner treated German bomb aim as a human-machine conversation. Crews came in high and tired, reading a blend of instruments, training, and whatever glow slipped through the blackout. Under stress, brains grab patterns. So give them a pattern, not a bonfire that reads wrong. A city has rhythm, like pools and gutters, flickers and steadies. Turner called it a grammar, streets and blocks speaking in flame and ember to a bomb aimer who only needed a nudge. To build that nudge, he went somewhere odd for a war project, Shepperton Film Studios. Set designers knew how to sell a lie at scale with nothing but angles and light. They could fake depth with staggered highlights, craft skylines with shadow seams, and time a power cut, cue that felt real because it was slightly imperfect. At Shepperton, Turner's team started sketching the city in embers alphabet. Sodium yellow glows for tram lines, dusky pools for warehouse yards, pinpoint leaks to mimic windows smashed by heat. They broke the Decoy world into 3 families. QF, special fire, was heat and flame you could control with trays, pans, and shallow pits fed by oil, water, and coke. It gave you ember fields and the hungry orange that tells a crew they've done damage. QL, special lighting, was light without fire. Masked bulbs, sodium sim lamps, glow boxes behind baffles, vehicle lights on rails you could start and kill on cue. And SF, Starfish, was the big canvas. City-scale arrays where QF and QL layered into something a navigator would swear was a dockland or a tram grid seen through haze. But none of it mattered if it didn't fit the geometry of a German run. Turner mapped distance from coast legs, habitual route bends, fuel ceilings that forced altitude choices, and the drift you get when wind and radio beams argue. He'd seen oil fires trick men's eyes before. He knew how a seam of brightness pulled hands toward a switch. The trick was timing. If you lit too early, pathfinders might spot the lie. Too late, bombs were already walking down High Street. You needed a window, and that window moved with cloud, wind, and the clockwork of enemy radio beams. Meanwhile, quietly, a separate fight rumbled in the ether. The RAF countered the German guidance under the codename Headache, and their answer, Aspirin, slipped deceptive tones into Nickerbean's lobes to make centered feel subtly off. Meacon stations, masking beacons, rebroadcast German navigational signals from British soil, bending bearings just enough to seed doubt. Turner didn't control those transmitters, but he could align his fall cities with where a bent bearing would coax a bomber stream. When dials whispered left, his ember streets needed to sit where left would feel right. Here, S-where procedure became a weapon. Turner pushed for ignition authority to sit with regional controllers who could see raids develop, not with London clerks. He wanted compartment maps split across ministries, so nobody outside the Corps could assemble the whole parallel Britain. Site crews appeared on perils as farm hands and drainage labor. Codes changed fast. Locations got alias names. Even within his own circle, people saw plans through keyholes. On the ground, the kit looked blunt. Star-shaped fire trays you could flood or feed, shallow pans that took a spark and held it, cable runs buried to tiny control bunkers with a field telephone and a man watching wind vanes. But the choreography was exact. Staggered ignitions to mimic fire racing along roofs, dark lanes to sell streets, flares of white to hint at a transformer or a warehouse door burning. A rail glow, line beyond the brightest pool, because crews trained to put second sticks where they'd already hurt something. Risk sat in every queue. Set one wrong and you'd teach the Luftwaffe to spot your lie. Use fuel too freely and you'd starve the next night's defense. Miss the wind call and smoke would smother the grammar into a smear the pathfinders would pass over. Turner drilled crews on shutoffs as hard as starts. If the run veered, drown the field. If the timing slipped, wait for the next wave. Discipline saved fuel and the fiction. In quiet moments at Shepperton, Turner and the set men argued about color temperature and shadow length like artists. Then they'd pin those arguments to the most brutal ledger a city keeps, where the bombs fell last time and where they must not fall again. Build a lie a mile wide, then move it 50 yards, then shave 10 seconds off the glow cycle. If the Luftwaffe trusted what their eyes and ears told them, the city would drink the bombs for the docks that couldn't afford another night like the last. The committee that didn't exist. Turner's idea needed a machine that could move money, men, fuel, and lies without leaving fingerprints. It started under home security as a cell so small it could meet in a corridor and not be noticed. No letterhead, no switchboard. If you asked who ran it, you got a shrug and a different name every week. The premise was simple. The more visible an organization is in a blackout, the more it glows on an enemy map. So they built something you couldn't see even if you worked inside it. Procedure carried the weight. Maps were chopped into compartments. Northing and easting grids split and filed in different ministries, so no single clerk could stack a whole decoy on the same desk. Site coordinates lived under alias names that sounded like drainage ditches and hedgerow cuts. Codes were single-use. If a controller burned one phrase to light a basin near a port, that phrase died by morning. Railway schedules that moved oil drums got buried inside agricultural freight tallies. Fuel requisitions looked like irrigation projects. When pay packets went out to the people who set the fires, they were listed as farm hands and canal maintenance. They drew a taxonomy like a civil service might, but it hid a second country. QF Special Fire sat on one set of ledgers, QL Special Lighting on another. SF Starfish belonged to neither and both, the large-scale arrays where those families met to sell a 12-mile lie. On paper, it looked like maintenance of rural works in scattered parishes. In reality, it was a parallel Britain designed to be read from 10,000 feet through a bomb site. Control was the tightest piece. Ignition authority couldn't live in Whitehall because London couldn't smell the wind over the Mendips or hear the uneven rumble that meant a stream had split. Regional controllers got that call. In low concrete bunkers with field telephones, they watched wind vanes and listened to filter rooms feed them raid tracks. A raid would cross the coast. A Pathfinder flare would land. Then a decision. Light the first lane, hold the second, kill the third. If anyone broke sequence, the grammar fell apart. If anyone guessed, you taught the Luftwaffe what not to hit next time. Money stayed quiet by design. Civilian ledgers masked the pulse. Cables went in as temporary lines for field drainage. Switchgear looked like pump stations. The crews who hauled coke and oil split their nights between honest farm work and the thing they couldn't mention in town. A site might be managed by a foreman who, by day, fixed fences. By night, he ran a countdown. 30 seconds after the first marker, bring up tray 3, wait for the second stick, open the pit near the rail yard. Inside the cell, even language was shaped to leave no echo. You didn't say Docklands. You said Area B. You didn't say Ignite. You said Open. Messages were clipped, stripped of nouns that might glow if intercepted. A young woman in a basement might spend 8 hours relaying grid letters and wind calls without knowing she just lit a phantom harbor that would drink a squadron's bombs. Meanwhile, at Shepperton, the studio veterans wrote cue sheets like stage managers, but the signatures were fed into the committee as anonymous patterns. A baffled design traveled as a diagram with no origin stamp. A timing tweak appeared as a column in a table, not an argument won over a lamp on a drawing board. If a Starfish worked, credit evaporated into the system. If it failed, the fix arrived as a new pattern and a reminder: never repeat an error within sight of an enemy camera. Security wasn't just to keep German eyes out, it also protected the logic. If you ran a decoy, you knew your switches, your wind, your fuel curve, and not much else. If you controlled a county, you knew your sites and didn't know your neighbor. London held a master ledger in pieces locked in red tag envelopes. The theory was brutal and clean. Break any one link and you couldn't reconstruct the chain. Here, where the metadata turned lethal. The committee didn't only stage light, it staged expectation. It synced QF, QL, SFQs to what the ether war would suggest. RAF Aspirin transmitters nudged Nickerbean's guidance so a crew heard, centered, while actually drifting. Meacon beacons, masking stations, picked up German navigational signals and rebroadcast them from new points, shifting bearings by degrees that felt like truth. The cell aligned Decoy sighting with those engineered errors. When a bomber's dial whispered a left correction, the full city sat where left would look and sound right. Meanwhile, anti-aircraft tracers and staged power cuts, stitched in the human detail crews, were trained to trust. Every piece had a failsafe, wind above a threshold, and the regional controller could black out the lie in a breath. A sudden pathfinder correction, and a site stood down to avoid teaching. Fuel rationing tightened, and QL took point while QF saved heat for the next moonless window. The doctrine evolved night by night, each raid folded into a private ledger of what sold and what rang false. Out in the fields, the people on those ledgers kept their heads down, took their pay as drainage, and went home with hair that smelled of smoke they couldn't admit they lit. When the first big Decoy nights held, when crater circles landed in marsh and scrub and steelworks roared on the next morning, the committee didn't claim a victory. It issued a new code list and moved on. The point wasn't applause. The point was to keep the map the Luftwaffe trusted a step wrong all winter long. Anatomy of a false city. From the road, a Starfish site looked like farm scrub stitched with low mounds. From 10 miles out, it was a city burning. The difference lived under the grass. Cables snaked to a squat concrete box half buried on a slope. A controller with a field phone, a wind vane, and a set of toggles labeled in a code that never said what anything really was. Out in the dark, men in soaked sacking stood by star-shaped trays, their arms like shallow steel petals, each plumbed to feed or drown flame with a twist. Oil, water, and coke waited in measured stacks, because fuel wasn't a bonfire, it was punctuation. The light grammar that Turner's team brought back from Shepperton started with ember. Cities don't blaze evenly, they pulse. So crews laid trays in staggered rows that could step fire across a block, leaving narrow black seams to read as streets. First Q, a low, dirty orange close to the ground, the color you get when beams catch roof tar and soaked joists. Then a brighter lick, a white orange pop to hint at a warehouse door giving. No symmetry, nothing perfect. Set designers drilled that into Q sheets. Kill perfection, because the eye knows a trick that loops too clean. Sound mattered. Timed bangs traveled on the wind, small detonators and fuel pops seeded to mimic secondary explosions, and the hollow thud of a gas main failing 2 blocks over. A scattered burst of clanks and crackles from tin, scrap in pans, sold the messy bite of a block in pain. In the control box, a chart listed delays. After initial ignition, bring yard 2 pops at 60 seconds, then let them roll off. If a real AA troop nearby chattered into the sky, the controller might cue a light flutter along a rail line to make crews believe they'd hit rolling stock. It wasn't theater for its own sake. It was a nudge to trained expectation. Navigation trickery lived in thin lines. A rail glow ran as a faint, unwavering smear that paralleled a brighter basin. Crews trained to walk sticks along rails after an initial hit would feel that tug. Near docks, pans set with water films reflected flame in a ripple that read as a key under haze. Set men from Shepperton argued for the angle of those reflections, the way a ripple should break, the fraction of dullness a sodium lamp would push through fog. QL, the quiet lighting kit, handled that. Masked bulbs in boxes, slotted baffles, and sodium sim lamps that put out that sickly tram yellow from a distance without throwing heat. QF was the heat. Pans and trays took oil, coke, sometimes soaked sacking that could hold a glow and spread it in a predictable crawl. Controllers could starve or feed the burn with water valves, changing the shape of a street mid-raid. A QF field felt alive under a hose. Drown a tray and ember lines bent around the dark like water meeting a rock. SF, the Starfish, was where those tools scaled to a city profile. Dozens of QF clusters braided with QL runs, a grammar big enough that a bomber saw not a trick but a neighborhood. The signature had to scream, hit again. That meant density gradients a bomb aimer recognized from training photos. Heavy burns near warehouses, softer, uneven pools across residential, and a clear brighter patch that implied power or plant. A staged power cut helped sell it. QL lanes blinked out in a stagger, then came back dirty, as if a substation limped. One detail from Shepperton earned a circle on Turner's board. Keep one wrong thing in sight. A steady, too-perfect line would betray the lie. A slight stutter in the tram told a brain it was human. All of it rode the wind. Every site had failsafes inked on the wall. If smoke stacked instead of sheeting, kill trays that fed the stack. If wind turned, protect the downwind black seams or the streets blur. If flares landed too close, shut the whole grammar, because a pathfinder overhead staring through a hood could learn more from a half-seen trick than from none at all. Emergency smothering kit sat in reach. Sand, water, canvas. Because the last sin was letting a decoy run hot past its cue and teach the wrong lesson at dawn. There was a lesson about layering. QL took point when fuel ran thin, a skeletal city of glow stitched to snaps of sound. QF came up only when the pathfinders' first candles fell, and only to the brightness the grammar demanded. Starfish arrays tied them together with a controller's breathing. Up, down, hold. Marching a blaze that never once burned wood, only oil and air. But convinced men in freezing cockpits, they just opened a seam in the heart of a port. Here's where the lie left the field and met the sky. In parallel, Aspirin transmitters pressed deceptive dots into Nickerbean's lobe so centered felt off-center. Meacon beacons rebroadcast bearings so home shifted by a mile that felt like none. The Decoy didn't fight those signals, it embraced them. Sites were sighted where a bent fix would drop a line of bombs if the eyes agreed. They made the eyes agree. When a dial said, "This is right," the glow below said, "You did it again." On the damage map that never left a basement, pencil rings piled where marsh should have been quiet. In the control bunkers, men counted to 60 with smoke in their hair and waited for the next wave. First blood, Bristol's phantom blaze. Bristol was a bull's, a deep water port feeding a war economy, aero works that turned aluminium and sweat into engines, rail knots that pulsed coal and food. German planners kept circling it in red. If a heavy stick walked through the docks and then across the works, you wouldn't just lose a night, you'd lose a month. Turner's team picked a basin on Blackdown in the Mendips, out beyond the city lights, where a dockland could bloom under cloud and sell the story before bombs crossed the river. Controllers shadowed the pathfinders off the coast by wire and voice. Filter rooms called bearings. A regional controller in a concrete box near the site watched a wind vane twitch. The first markers fell on the real city, feeble pale candles in smoke, and he counted. 30 seconds, 40. He lifted one toggle. QL lanes blinked awake in a faint sodium smear that read like a tram grid broken by dark. A minute later, he opened the first QF trays. Ember crawled along a quay and bled into a basin that hadn't seen water in a century. The human edge lived in the field. Men in soaked sacking crouched by trays with paraffin-streaked hands, timing their sparks to a cue sheet pinned to memory. A wrong second could flatten the grammar. A gust hit, and one man shielded a flame with his body, so the tray took on the first try. Another watched smoke go vertical and reached for a valve to starve a line before it stacked and blurred the street. Their faces shone orange for a breath, then went black again, heads down as if prayer could keep wind steady. Up above, the bomb stream bent. Crews felt the pull the doctrine had trained into them, hit the bright first, then walk left along the rail glow. The rail wasn't steel. It was a QL smear laid just beyond the brightest pool, steady as a ruler, selling that old habit. A stick hit scrub and peat with a thud that made men in the bunker flinch. No screams, no siren run, just that ticking shrapnel in wet ground that meant a gamble paid. Near Rington Warren, the damage map would later show a rash of craters where hedgerows should have been unbroken. In Bristol proper, you still got fire. This wasn't magic. But the centre kept air whole blocks that should have taken a second stick didn't. A hospital's night porter swore he'd felt the ground shiver and then go quiet, and the ward lights, dim and rationed, stayed steady enough to move the next trolley. On the docks, cranes that had been chalked as probable losses stood in the dawn light with fresh scuffs and new prayers. Controllers logged like accountants. Time on first marker, wind at tray height, delay to first QLQ, delay to first QF ember, ratio of bombs in decoy grid to bombs in city proper, pulled from the post-raid survey with boots still wet from marsh water. The ledger started to show a curve. If you lit within a tight window after Pathfinder markers, and your glow lanes sat just wrong relative to a bent beam, crews would drift toward the line. If you let QL sell the skeleton first, and only fed QF to match, your fuel went half as far and bought the same pull. There were mistakes. One Q ran hot for 10 seconds too long, and a Pathfinder wandering high searched it with a glide. The controller killed the lane, drowned a bright tray with a hiss that steamed the windscreen of the man who'd lit it. A second Q failed to spark, and a dark seam opened where a street should have stitched through. A runner sprinted with a flare to seed a quick white pop that read like a roof failing. It sold enough for the moment. It was marked for redesign by morning. But the pattern held. The first night didn't save a city alone. It saved a run, then a block, then a crane that loaded a ship that left on time. The next raid, the timing tightened. Controllers shaved 5 seconds off one Q, moved a QL rail smear by a yard, and watched the stick bend just a little earlier. Turner's team folded that into the tables, delay bands narrowed, spacing ratios refined. What looked like art from the field became numbers on a page, and those numbers told crews when to take the risk and when to drown a tray. In town, nobody got medals for fields that burned right. The men went home with smoke ground into their hair and pay envelopes stamped drainage. A woman who'd held a field phone to her ear for 3 hours, relaying wind calls and grid letters, bought bread on the way back to a bedsit and slept through her alarm. A dock fitter turned his cap in his hands and said he'd heard them go past, west and south, and stood until he couldn't hear them anymore. After action, the Bristol board in a basement that didn't have a name took 3 new pencil circles and drew them on a marsh. A second board, further up the chain, got a copy without place names, just times and hits, and the quiet math that said the fiction pulled a payload off the works. The lesson wasn't a speech. It was a new cue sheet, a reprinted code list, a shipment of coke that somehow moved under an agricultural stamp. First blood went to a city that didn't exist, and Bristol woke up with bruises instead of broken bones. Scaling the illusion from fields to a network. Proof meant pressure,